Hey there. I wanted to do a quick video showing the process for painting this sort of spooky Halloween image, kind of sweetly spooky, I guess. Pretty easy image to build up, and I think you'll see it's just a couple of pretty simple steps, and I will walk you through it. One of the things I wanted to go over is the build up, or kind of the the studies of the final. I always do a ton of these little studies, and sometimes they're black and white sketches, sometimes they're just color swatches and things like that. But in this case, I just did a quick color study, and that's just using just a variety of pretty opaque brushes you can see here. And here's another one that I'm getting ready to do as well, and I'm just painting that and figuring out the value. If you guys have been watching any of my videos, you know that I'm a big advocate of controlling value and using a very limited amount of value. And so that's why I wanted to show you this part first, because a lot of times, especially when you have bigger scenes, the question is always, how do you put a lot of stuff in there without it getting overwhelming? And I'll show you how I think about that. You can see I've got these two values here. I'm just painting them a little bit bigger so you can see. And that's kind of how I did this whole thing. There is basically two values that I'm working around. You've got your light value, which I'll call number one, and your dark value, which is number two. And so this whole scene is basically those two values on top of each other. If I were to silhouette, just use two values down here, kind of a similar shape as the image above, as the Halloween image, it would look something like this. And I know the proportions aren't exactly right, but just giving you the idea, something like that. All right. So now we've got our two values, and I try to keep my value range really simple. This is going to be a little bit lower. Keep my value range really simple. Obviously, our cat's going to be up there. And notice I've only used two values. I haven't used a lot of other kind of things to other values, and even though there is going to be more detail in it, a lot of times people get so detailed with so much stuff in their image, and each thing has its own light and dark and shadow and all that stuff, that all of a sudden you lose the simplicity of this 1 2 kind of setup. And so I always like to stay as simple as I can, and so a lot of times I'll even start with just these two values. I know I'm not going to be able to do all the detail, but I want this to be the idea. Oops. I want this whole thing to be the idea. And notice how when I back down here, I know it's really tiny on your screen. If you barely squint your eyes, you will see the value breakdown. And so that's kind of how I build these things up. And so I start like this. And then once you have your overall dark, your basic dark value, and your overall light value, then you can start adding detail to both of those areas just barely. So if I use this value and this value, those are built from that first starter kind of square, or that swatch. Same thing here. If I go a little bit darker, and I just want to make sure as I build up two values that these stay separate. These values down here are going to be dark. These values up here are going to be light. And I can add as many of them as I want. I could even go to a full black. As long as anything that's in this area down here stays with these values, I can add as much detail as I want and it doesn't get confusing. And then up here, as long as I add these values and don't add anything darker, it stays workable. And so you've seen that I've done that in this image too, that I'm getting ready to paint as well. It's basically a two value setup as well, but I've added these additional values here. So let's go ahead and start to break that up a little bit. You can see how quick you can get a little bit of detail going just by using those simple values that I pulled off of the main value. And so it's great because they never ever I can even use a little bit more textured brush, which I do quite a bit. Oops. You know, sometimes I just paint like this just to get a bunch of different kind of shapes going. And then I'll clean up the shapes a little bit. And you can see I've got just a ton of room that I can do anything I want to with in that area. Now, the one thing that I did, the only time I broke that idea was when I brought the ghost in there. So you can break it a little bit, but you want of all those areas that are in the dark, notice as long as if I just have my little ghost in there, that's what you're going to look at. And the same thing with the cat. He's all black, but I've got these eyes right there and that becomes brighter. Now I'll go ahead and work on the background up here. I'll just go a little value darker. And that's kind of my base setup for my trees and things like that. And the background gravestones. So it's a really easy thing to do as long as you break it down to what's in the light and keep those areas light and what's in the dark and keep those areas dark. You can have as much value or as much detail as you want within those two things, just as long as you keep them clearly separated. It works pretty well. All right, let's go over here. So here's the same deal. Notice when I back up, it's the exact same value. It's just more a little bit controlled brush work and detail and things like that. So let me turn all this off and I'll show you how I built it up. So I do it in stages. And so this will be my background grouping. And all that is just a single slight adjustment from the green value to a yellow. And then I darken that just barely. I do a lot of these things. It's only 7% in my opacity. If I go to full opacity, that's what it is. So I do all these little subtle deals, these little layers, and knock them back a little bit. So I add something and then I'll knock it back. So that's just my background. Pretty quickly in here, I will add a layer to the top of my layer stack, and that is just a watercolor piece of paper that I made. If I move it to normal, that's what it looks like. It's just a scanned watercolor piece set to overlay. Overlay allows some of the texture to show through without actually changing the value too much. Notice how when I add this, it adds a little bit lighter and a little bit darker kind of texture over the whole thing, but it doesn't change my overall value that much. Okay, we'll go to the next grouping. That's going to be just my rough build-in of my ground plane. And that's all it is there. And notice that watercolor layer on top that's set to overlay is still doing some heavy work. Like anything I add there, if I just add just a big, whatever I add, a circle or a shape or whatever, you can still see that texture. The darker the value gets, the more you can actually see that texture that's on top of it. But it's really just looks like that. It's just a flat kind of thing. So I established just where the ground plane is. And normally I try to, as a design kind of option, I keep that at the 1/3 mark or maybe a little bit below. If I were to make a 1/3 line, I guess it would be about right there. So I keep it at the 1/3 line or a little bit below. The big thing you don't want to do with a horizon line is cut your image in half and make it split right in the middle between sky and ground. So either make it about the sky and give the sky more area, or make it about the ground and make the ground go all the way up to the 2/3 mark, about right there. I go ahead and just with my really rough brayer brush, that brush right there, just go ahead and start to hint at what that background value is going to be. And then, like I said earlier, just like in this one, we've got our base dark. And so then I can start to just paint some rougher kind of values in there. I just really want to keep this lower section dark and this upper section light, like I said earlier. And then I make new layers. I don't add a ton of different things on top of them. But I do like to keep different layers so I can just turn it off and on and say, oh, did I go too dark or did I go too light? Just to control it. And then pretty quickly after that, I mean, you can see how fast, that step would be. We're almost halfway there. And that's why this is such a fast painting. I think the total working time for me on this was about an hour and a half or something like that. It's pretty fast. So this is where it starts to look like a real painting. And so I know a lot of people are uncomfortable when it's at this loose stage, but you want to stay there as long as you can. And I'll show you this next build, starting from the ground up. So again, I have this dark shape against a light background. You're gonna get sick of hearing that from me, but it's a very common, just base way of working. And then I just wanted to lighten it just a little bit. I'm adding just a couple of different kind of shapes in there, barely even making a difference. This is the big one though, where I get a couple of tones in there. You can see it's kind of green over here. It goes to a little bit bluer, and then I've got a little bit of a darker wash at the bottom. So once I get enough variation in a certain area, then I can just start selecting and making new shapes. And that's all that is just really simple shapes like that. Once you already have it, the darkness in there, just like I did on the black and white one, you just barely change the value and you can start getting some of those shapes in there. So all these are just big shapes, but again, they work with they're in the dark. So all of them, even though this goes a little bit lighter over here than this, they're all still going to read as dark. Add a little bit of darkness underneath the main area where the ghost is going to be, because I want the ghost to pop off of that. And then one little dark gravestone down there at the bottom. For some of the gravestones, what I'm doing to get the texture is I am using the lasso tool, and then I just make a shape like that, and that way it's controlled. I'll open up the bottom a little bit. That way it's controlled at the top. So I'll get a real nice, here I'm going to hide my edges. So I still have my selection. But it's still turned on. The selection is still there. It's just hidden. So since the selection was open at the bottom, I get a real tight, crisp line at the top. And then at the bottom, I can kind of bleed it in to where I don't have like a hard edge at the bottom. So I do that technique a lot. Now let me get rid of that. There we go. All right, the next one is the little ghost. And the same thing I have done before. All I do is just basically here, I'll use the actual color. So use this gray, I just kind of bump it all in there. And then I make a layer mask and carve the ghost out of that. So you can see with no layer mask on, that's all it is right there. And then I just shape it using the layer mask. This is just a glow layer, and it's an overlay layer set to 71% with a soft brush. And so all that's doing is just making that glow. It's a light blue selection. Cat's just drawn in there. No technique there, just using a rough edge brush and just kind of shaping him in there. All right, so that's like kind of the main thing. So there's exactly what I was talking about earlier. I've got my areas of light, and then I've got my areas of dark. And, sometimes I like to do like a little bit of a fade. So I just did want to point out this one little area is, if this was really dark up here, it would, because it's against the light, remember, every contrast is what people notice. And so if this was really dark all the way across, it might start to call too much attention to this area. And that's the reason I keep it, I have this gradient going from sort of the light value in the background to fading into the dark area at the bottom, if that makes sense. And so I want people to notice this area first. That's my subject matter. And so anything that starts to take away from that, like a really hard, obvious shape that has a lot of contrast, I'm going to knock it back a little bit. And that's the technique for keeping your details in there, but not having them overwhelm the work. Okay, so just like I did in the black and white piece, just adding some more gravestones, but keeping them in the light area. And then this is the one everybody wants to do first. They want to just add all the details, and all that is just an opaque little pencil kind of brush. And then lastly, I thought this started to go a little bit too green, and so I did a hue saturation layer. You can see it right here. It's only set to 55%. I think I just changed the cyans. Yeah, there we go. So I just pull this down and only change the cyan. So you can see if I ratchet that up, it only changes just whatever you select there. So if I were to go to yellows, whoops, yellows, it'll probably affect the background. See that? So I could heat up that background if I wanted to, or even change to a different hue. That's actually pretty nice. Well, I like that. Maybe I'll keep that. Maybe not that hot, but that's pretty nice. Anyway, so you can play with that kind of stuff, and it's a whole lot of fun just to isolate different colors within that, and then mess around with your color balance. Here, I'll put it back just for what we're doing. But I actually like that. Anyway, that's the technique. You know, the work is mainly simple in this idea. You know, without these steps, becomes hard, but because you've figured out your value structure, it goes really fast. Like I said, hour or 2 hours. You know, just using some rough brushes and some pretty clumsy kind of drawing. But as long as the value stays controlled, it's going to hold together pretty nice. So hope that helps some of you. I know a lot of you want to put a lot of stuff in the images, but this is a way to control all that stuff and have it work together. So yeah, let me know if you have any questions in the comments. I'd love to answer it. Thanks.